In 1909, while Philip Kerr, Lothian, Lionel Curtis and Sir William Mallis were in Canada, laying the foundations for the Round Table organization there, Marius persuaded Curtis that, quote, self-government, however far distant, was the only intelligible goal of British policy in India. The existence of political unrest in India, so far from being a reason for pessimism, was the surest sign that the British, with all their manifest failings, had not shirked their primary duty of extending Western education to India, and so preparing Indians to govern themselves. 4 years later, the Round Table Group in London decided to investigate how this could be done. It formed a study group of 8 members, under Curtis, adding to the group 3 officials from the India Office. This group decided in 1915 to issue a public declaration favoring the progressive realization of responsible government in India. A declaration to this effect was drawn up by Lord Milner and was issued on August 20th, 1917 by Secretary of State for India Edwin S. Montagu. It said, quote, the policy of His Majesty's government, with which the government of India are in complete accord, is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration, and the gradual development of self-governing institutions, with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. This declaration was revolutionary because for the first time it specifically enunciated British hopes for India's future, and because it used for the first time the words responsible government. The British had spoken vaguely for over a century about self-government for India. They had spoken increasingly about representative government, but they had consistently avoided the expression responsible government. This latter term meant parliamentary government, which most English conservatives regarded as quite unsuited for Indian conditions, since it required, they believed, an educated electorate and a homogeneous social system, both of which were lacking in India. The conservatives had talked for years about ultimate self-government for India on some indigenous Indian model, but had done nothing to find such a model. Then, without any clear conception of where they were going, they had introduced representative government, in which the executive consulted with public opinion through representatives of the people, either appointed, as in 1861, or elected, as in 1909. But with the executive still autocratic and in no way responsible to these representatives. The use of the expression responsible government in the Declaration of 1917 went back to the Round Table Group and ultimately to the Mallis-Curtis conversation in the Canadian Rockies in 1909. In the meantime, the Round Table Study Group had worked for 3 years, 1913 to 1916, on methods for carrying out this promise. Through the influence of Curtis and F.S. Oliver, the Federal Constitution of the United States contributed a good deal to the drafts which were made, especially to provisions for dividing governmental activities into central and provincial portions, with gradual Indianization of the latter, and ultimately of the former. This approach to the problem was named diarchy by Curtis. The Round Table draft was sent to the Governor of New South Wales, Lord Chelmsford, a Fellow of All Souls College, who believed that it came from an official committee of the India Office. After he accepted it in principle, he was made Viceroy of India in 1916. Curtis went to India immediately to consult with local authorities there, including Master Maurice Haley and the retired Times foreign editor Sir Valentine Jerome, as well as with Indians. From these conferences emerged a report written by Maurice, which was issued as the Montagu-Chelmsford Report in 1917. The provisions of this report were drawn up as a bill passed by Parliament after substantial revision by a joint committee under Lord Selborne, and became the Government of India Act of 1919. The Act of 1919 was the most important law in Indian constitutional history before 1935. It divided governmental activities into central and provincial. The former included defense, foreign affairs, railways and communications, commerce, civil and criminal law and procedures, and others. The latter included public order and police, irrigation, forests, education, public health, public works, and other activities. Furthermore, the provincial activities were divided into transferred departments and reserved departments, the former being entrusted to native ministers who were responsible to provincial assemblies. The central government remained in the hands of the Governor-General and Viceroy, who was responsible to Britain and not to the Indian legislature. His cabinet, executive council, usually had 3 Indian members after 1921. The legislature was bicameral, consisting of a Council of State and a Legislative Assembly. In both, some members were appointed officials, but the majority were elected on a very restricted suffrage. There were, on the electoral lists, no more than 900,000 voters for the lower chamber and only 16,000 for the upper chamber. The provincial unicameral legislatures had a wider but still limited franchise, with about 1 million on the list of voters in Bengal, half as many in Bombay. Moreover, certain seats, on the principle of weightage, were reserved to Muslims elected by a separate Muslim electoral list. Both legislatures had the power to enact laws, subject to rather extensive powers of veto and of decree in the hands of the Governor-General and the appointed provincial governors. Only the transferred departments of the provincial governments were responsible to elective assemblies. The reserved activities on the provincial level and all activities in the central administration being responsible to the appointed governors and Governor-General and ultimately to Britain. It was hoped that the Act of 1919 would provide opportunities in parliamentary procedures, responsible government and administration to India, so that self-government could be extended by successive steps later. But these hopes were destroyed in the disasters of 1919 to 1922. The violence of British reactionaries collided with a non-violent refusal to cooperate of Mahatma Gandhi, crushing out the hopes of the Round Table reformers between them. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, known as Mahatma or Great Sale, was the son and grandson of prime ministers of a minute princely state in western India. Of the Vaisya caste, third of the 4, he grew up in a very religious and ascetic atmosphere of Hinduism. Married at 13 and a father at 15, Gandhi was sent to England to study law by his elder brother when he was 17. Such a voyage was forbidden by the rules of his caste, and he was expelled from it for going. Before he left, he gave a vow to his family not to touch wine, women, or meat. After 3 years in England, he passed the bar at Inner Temple. Most of his time in Europe was passed in dilettante fads, experimenting with vegetarian diets and self-administered medicines or in religious or ethical discussions with English faddists and Indiophiles. He was much troubled by religious scruples and feelings of guilt. Back in India in 1891, he was a failure as a lawyer because of his inarticulate lack of assurance and his real lack of interest in the law. In 1893, a Muslim firm sent him to Natal, South Africa on a case. There Gandhi found his vocation. The population of Natal in 1896 consisted of 50,000 Europeans, mostly English, 400,000 African natives, and 51,000 Indians, chiefly outcasts. The last group had been imported from India, chiefly as indentured workers on 3 or 5 year contracts, to work the humid lowland plantations where the Negroes refused to work. Most of the Indians stayed after their contracts were fulfilled, and were so industrious and intelligent that they began to rise very rapidly in an economic sense, especially in the retail trades. The whites, who were often indolent, resented such competition from dark-skinned persons, and were generally indignant at Indian economic success. As Lionel Curtis told Gandhi in the Transvaal in 1903, quote, "It is not the vices of Indians that Europeans in this country fear, but their virtues." When Gandhi first arrived in Natal in 1893, he found that that country, like most of South Africa, was rent with color hatred and group animosities. All political rights were in the hands of whites, while the non-whites were subjected to various kinds of social and economic discriminations and segregations. When Gandhi first appeared in court, the judge ordered him to remove his turban, worn with European clothes. Gandhi refused and left. Later, traveling on business in a first-class railway carriage to the Transvaal, he was ejected from the train at the insistence of a white passenger. He spent a bitterly cold night on the railway platform rather than to move to a second or third-class compartment when he had been sold a first-class ticket. For the rest of his life, he traveled only third class. In the Transvaal, he was unable to get a room in a hotel because of his color. These episodes gave him his new vocation, to establish that Indians were citizens of the British Empire and therefore entitled to equality under its laws. He was determined to use only peaceful methods of passive mass non-cooperation to achieve his goal. His chief weapon would be love and submissiveness, even to those who treated him most brutally. His refusal to fear death or to avoid pain, and his efforts to return love to those who tried to inflict injuries upon him, made a powerful weapon, especially if it were practiced on a mass basis. Gandhi's methods were really derived from his own Hindu tradition, but certain elements in this tradition had been reinforced by reading Ruskin, Thoreau, Tolstoy, and the Sermon on the Mount. When he was brutally beaten by whites in Natal in 1897, he refused to prosecute, saying that it was not their fault that they had been taught evil ideas. These methods gave the Indians of South Africa a temporary respite from the burden of intolerance under Gandhi's leadership in the period 1893 to 1914, when the Transvaal proposed an ordinance compelling all Indians to register, be fingerprinted, and carry identity cards at all times. Gandhi, actually this is what is happening in Croatia, a country where I live, and probably in most countries of Europe, these things are required from you. Gandhi, because of this, organized a mass peaceful refusal to register. Hundreds went to jail. Smuts, worked out a compromise with Gandhi. If the Indians would register voluntarily, the Transvaal would repeal the ordinance. After Gandhi had persuaded his compatriots to register, Smuts failed to carry out his part of the agreement, and the Indians solemnly burned their registration cards at a mass meeting. Then, to test the Transvaal ban on Indian immigration, Gandhi organized mass marches of Indians into the Transvaal from Natal. Others went from the Transvaal to Natal and returned, being arrested for crossing the frontier. At one time, 2,500 of the 13,000 Indians in the Transvaal were in jail and 6,000 were in exile. The struggle was intensified after the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 because the Transvaal restrictions of Indians, which forbade them to own land, to live outside segregated districts, or to vote, were not repealed, and a Supreme Court decision of 1913 declared all non-Christian marriages to be legally invalid. This last decision deprived most non-white wives and children of all legal protection of their family rights. Mass civil disobedience by Indians increased, including a march by 6,000 from Natal to the Transvaal. Finally, after much controversy, Gandhi and Smuts worked out an elaborate compromise agreement in 1914. This revoked some of the discriminations against Indians in South Africa, recognized Indian marriages, annulled a discriminatory £3 annual tax on Indians, and stopped all importation of indentured labor from India in 1920. Peace was restored in this civil controversy just in time to permit a united front in the external war with Germany. But in South Africa by 1914, Gandhi had worked out the techniques he would use against the British in India after 1919. Until 1919, Gandhi was very loyal to the British connection. Both in South Africa and in India, he had found that the English from England were much more tolerant and understanding than most of the English-speaking whites of middle-class origin in the overseas areas. In the Boer War, he was the active leader of an 1,100-man Indian ambulance corps which worked with inspiring courage even under fire on the field of battle. During World War I, he worked constantly on recruiting campaigns for the British forces. On one of these in 1915, he said, quote, "I discovered that the British Empire had certain ideals with which I have fallen in love, and one of these ideals is that every subject of the British Empire has the freest scope possible for his energy and honor at whatever he thinks is due to his conscience." By 1918, this apostle of non-violence was saying, quote, "We are regarded as a cowardly people. If we want to become free from that reproach, we should learn to use arms. Partnership in the Empire is our definite goal. We should suffer to the utmost of our ability, and even lay down our lives to defend the Empire. If the Empire perishes, with it perishes our cherished aspiration." During this period, Gandhi's asceticism and his opposition to all kinds of discrimination were winning him an outstanding moral position among the Indian people. He was opposed to all violence and bloodshed, to alcohol, meat and tobacco, even to the eating of milk and eggs, and to sex, even in marriage. More than this, he was opposed to Western industrialism, to Western science and medicine, and to the use of Western rather than Indian languages. He demanded that his followers make fixed quotas of homespun cotton each day, wore a minimum of homespun clothing himself, spun on a small wheel throughout all his daily activities, and took the small hand spinning wheel as the symbol of his movement, all this in order to signify the honorable nature of handwork. the need for Indian economic self-sufficiency, and his opposition to Western industrialism. He worked for equality for the untouchables, calling them God's children, Harijans, and associating with them whenever he could, taking them into his own home, even adopting one as his own daughter. He worked to relieve economic oppression, organizing strikes against low wages or miserable working conditions, supporting the strikers with money he had gathered from India's richest Hindu industrialists. He attacked Western medicine and sanitation, supported all kinds of native medical nostrums and even quackery, yet went to a Western-trained surgeon for an operation when he had appendicitis himself. Similarly, he preached against the use of milk, but drank goat's milk for his health much of his life. These inconsistencies he attributed to his own weak sinfulness. Similarly, he permitted hand-spun cotton to be sewn on single sewing machines, and conceded the Western-type factories were necessary to provide such machines. During this period, he discovered that his personal fasts from food, which he had long practiced, could be used as moral weapons against those who opposed him, while they strengthened his moral hold over those who supported him. I fasted, he said, to reform those who loved me. You cannot fast against a tyrant. Gandhi never seemed to recognize that his fasting and non-violent civil disobedience were effective against the British in India and in South Africa only to the degree that the British had the qualities of humanity, decency, generosity, and fair play which he most admired, but that by attacking the British through these virtues, he was weakening Britain and the class which possessed these virtues, and making it more likely that they would be replaced by nations and by leaders who did not have these virtues. Certainly Hitler and the Germans, who exterminated 6 million Jews in cold blood during World War II, would not have shared the reluctance of Smuts to imprison a few thousand Indians, or Lord Halifax's reluctance to see Gandhi starve himself to death. Indians or Lord Halifax's reluctance to see Gandhi starve. This was the fatal weakness of Gandhi's aims and his methods. But these aims and methods were so dear to Indian hearts and so selflessly pursued by Gandhi that he rapidly became the spiritual leader of the Indian National Congress after Gokhale's death in 1915. In this position, Gandhi, by his spiritual power, succeeded in something which no earlier Indian leader had achieved and few had hoped for. He spread political awareness and nationalist feeling from the educated class down into the great uneducated mass of the Indian people. This mass and Gandhi expected and demanded a greater degree of self-government after the end of World War I. The Act of 1919 provided that, and probably provided as much of it as the political experience of Indians entitled them to. Moreover, the Act anticipated expansion of the areas of self-government as Indian political experience increased. But the Act was largely a failure because Gandhi had aroused political ambitions in great masses of Indians who lacked experience in political activities, and these demands gave rise to intense opposition to Indian self-government in British circles, which did not share the ideals of the Round Table Group. Finally, the actions of this British opposition drove Gandhi from non-resistance through complete non-cooperation to civil disobedience, thus destroying the whole purpose of the Act of 1919. Many British conservatives, both at home and in India, opposed the Act of 1919. Lord Imperial, who had long experience in India and had valiantly supported Gandhi in South Africa, attacked the Act and Lionel Curtis for making it. In the House of Lords he said, quote, "The incredible fact is that but for the chance visit to India of a globe-trotting doctrinaire with a positive mania for constitution-mongering, Curtis, nobody in the world would ever have thought of so peculiar a notion as diarchy." And yet the Joint Selborne Committee tells us in an airy manner that no better plan can be conceived. In India, men like Governor of the Punjab, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, were even more emphatically opposed to Indian self-government or Indian nationalist agitation. Many conservatives who were determined to maintain the empire intact could not see how this could be done without India as the major jewel in it, as in the 19th century. India not only provided a larger share of the manpower in the peacetime Imperial army, but this army was largely stationed in India and paid for out of the revenues of the government of India. Moreover, this self-paying manpower pool was beyond the scrutiny of the British reformer as well as the British taxpayer. The older Tories, with their strong army connections, and others like Winston Churchill, with an appreciation of military matters, did not see how England could face the military demands of the 20th century without Indian military manpower, at least in colonial areas. Instead of getting more freedom at the end of the war in 1918, the Indians got less. The Conservative group pushed through the Rowlatt Act in March 1990. This continued most of the wartime restrictions on civil liberties in India to be used to control nationalist agitations. Gandhi called for civil disobedience and a series of scattered local general strikes, cartels in protest. These actions led to violence, especially to Indian attacks on the British. Gandhi bewailed this violence. He bewailed this violence. And inflicted a 72-hour fast on himself as penance. In Amritsar, an Englishwoman was attacked in the street. 1990. The Congress Party leaders in the city were deported, and Brigadier R.E.H. Dyer was sent to restore order. On arrival, he prohibited all processions and meetings. Then, without waiting for the order to be publicized, went with 50 men to disperse with gunfire a meeting already in progress, April 13, 1919. He fired 1,650 bullets into a dense crowd packed in a square with inadequate exits, inflicting 1,516 casualties, of which 379 met death. Leaving the wounded untended on the ground, General Dyer returned to his office and issued an order that all Indians passing through the street where the Englishwoman had been assaulted a week before must do so by crawling on hands and knees. There is no doubt that General Dyer was looking for trouble. In his own words, quote, "I had made up my mind I would do all men to death. It was no longer a question of merely dispersing the crowd, but one of producing a sufficient moral effect from a military point of view, not only on those who were present, but more especially throughout the Punjab. The situation might still have been saved from Daya's barbarity, but the Hunter Committee, which investigated the atrocity, refused to condemn Daya except for a, quote, grave error of judgment, and, quote, an honest but mistaken conception of duty. A majority in the House of Lords approved his action by refusing to censure him, and when the government forced him to resign from the army, his admirers in England presented him with a sword and a purse of £20,000, which was a great deal of money in those days. At this point, Gandhi committed a grave error of judgment. In order to solidify the alliance of Hindu and Muslim, which had been in existence since 1917, he supported the Caliphate movement of Indian Muslims to obtain a lenient peace treaty for the Turkish Sultan and Caliph following World War I. Gandhi suggested that the Caliphate adopt non-cooperation against Britain to enforce its demands. This would have involved a boycott of British goods, schools, law courts, officers' honours, and of all goods subject to British taxes, such as alcohol. This was an error of judgment because the Sultan was soon overthrown by his own people, organizing a Turkish nationalist movement and seeking a secularized Turkish state, in spite of all Britain was already doing, both in public and in private, to support him. Thus the Khilafat movement was seeking to force Britain to do something it already wanted to do and was not able to do. Moreover, by bringing up non-cooperation as a weapon against the British, Gandhi had opened a number of doors he had no desire to open, with very bad consequences for India. At the Indian National Congress of December 1919, Tilak and Gandhi were the leading figures. Both were willing to accept the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, Tilak because he believed this would be the best way to prove that they were not adequate, but on August 1, 1920, Gandhi proclaimed non-cooperation in behalf of the Khilafat movement. On the same day, Tilak died, leaving Gandhi as undisputed leader of the Congress. At the 1920 meeting, he won unanimous approval for non-cooperation, and then moved a resolution for Swaraj, self-rule, either within or outside the British Empire. The Muslims in Congress, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, refused to accept an independent India outside the British Empire because this would subject the Muslims to a Hindu majority without Britain's protecting restraint. As a result, from that point, many Muslims left the Congress. Non-cooperation was a great public success, but it did not get self-rule for India, and made the country less fitted for self-rule by making it impossible for Indians to get experience in government under the Act of 1919. Thousands of Indians gave up medals and honours, gave up the practice of law in British courts, left the British schools, and burned British goods. Gandhi held great mass meetings at which thousands of persons stripped themselves of their foreign clothing to throw it on raging bonfires. This did not, however, give them training in government. It merely aroused nationalist violence. On February 1, 1922, Gandhi informed the Viceroy that he was about to begin mass civil disobedience, in one district at a time, beginning in Bardoli near Bombay. Civil disobedience, including refusal to pay taxes or obey the laws, was a step beyond non-cooperation. It involved illegal acts rather than legal ones. On February 5, 1922, a Hindu mob attacked 22 police constables and killed them by burning the police station down over their heads. In horror, Gandhi cancelled the campaign against Britain. He was at once arrested and condemned to 6 years in prison for sedition. Very great damage had been done by the events of 1919 to 1922. Britain and India were alienated to the point where they no longer trusted one another. The Congress Party itself had been split, the moderates forming a new group called the Indian Liberal Federation. The Muslims had also left the Congress Party to a large extent and gone to strengthen the Muslim League. From this point onward, Muslim-Hindu riots were annual occurrences in India, and finally the boycott had crippled the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, almost two-thirds of the eligible voters refusing to vote in the council's elections of November 1920. Ireland to 1939. While the Indian crisis was at its height in 1919 to 1922, an even more violent crisis was raging in Ireland. Throughout the 19th century, Ireland had been agitated by grievances of long standing. The three major problems were agrarian, religious, and political. The Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 17th century had transferred much Irish land as plunder of war to absentee English landlords. In consequence, high rents, insecure tenure, lack of improvements, and legalized economic exploitation, supported by English judges and English soldiers, gave rise to violent agrarian unrest and rural atrocities against English lives and properties. Beginning with Gladstone's Land Act of 1870, the agrarian problems were slowly alleviated, and by 1914 were well in hand. The religious problem arose from the fact that Ireland was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and resented being ruled by persons of a different religion. Moreover, until the Irish Episcopal Church was disestablished in 1869, Irish Catholics had to support a structure of Anglican clergy and bishops, most of whom had few or no parishioners in Ireland and resided in England, supported by incomes from Ireland. Finally, the Act of Union of 1801 had made Ireland a part of the United Kingdom, with representatives in the Parliament at Westminster. By 1871, those representatives who were opposed to union with England had formed the Irish Home Rule Party. It sought to obtain separation by obstructing the functions of Parliament and disrupting its proceedings. At times, this group exercised considerable influence in Parliament by holding a balance of power between Liberals and Conservatives. The Gladstone Liberals were willing to give Ireland Home Rule, with no representatives at Westminster. The Conservatives, with the support of a majority of Englishmen, were opposed to Home Rule. The Rhodes Milner Group wanted self-government for the Irish in their home affairs, with Irish representatives retained at Westminster for foreign and imperial matters. The Liberal government of 1906 to 1916 tried to enact a Home Rule Bill with continued Irish representation in the House of Commons, but was repeatedly blocked by the opposition of the House of Lords. The bill did not become law until September 1914. The chief opposition arose from the fact that Protestant Ulster, Northern Ireland, would be submerged in an overwhelmingly Catholic Ireland. The Ulster opposition, led by Sir Edward, later Lord Carson, organized a private army, armed it with guns smuggled from Germany, and prepared to seize control of Belfast at a signal from London. I suppose this Lord Edward Carson was the one who prosecuted Oscar Wilde. I have to check this. Edward Carson, Lord Edward Carson. Yes, he is the one who prosecuted Oscar Wilde. So he received weapons from Germany. Well. Later the Soviets will finance the disorder in Ulster. Carson was on his way to the telegraph station to send this signal in 1914 when he received a message from the Prime Minister that the war was about to break out with Germany. Accordingly, the Ulster Revolt was cancelled, and the Home Rule Act was suspended until 6 months after the peace with Germany. As a consequence, the revolt with German arms in Ireland was made by the Irish nationalists in 1916 instead of by their Ulster opponents in 1914. This so-called Easter Revolt of 1916 was crushed and its leaders executed, but discontent continued to simmer in Ireland, with violence only slightly below the surface. In the parliamentary election of 1918, Ireland elected 6 nationalists who wanted Home Rule for all Ireland, 73 Sinn Féin who wanted an Irish Republic free from England, and 23 Unionists who wanted to remain part of Britain. Instead of going to Westminster, the Sinn Féin organised their own parliament in Dublin. Efforts to arrest its members led to open civil war. This was a struggle of assassination, treachery and reprisal, fought out in back alleys and on moonlit fields. 60,000 British troops could not maintain order. Thousands of lives were lost, with brutal inhumanity on both sides, and property damage rose to £50 million in value. Lionel Curtis, who helped edit the Round Table in 1919 to 1921, advocated in the March 1920 issue that Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland be separated and each given a Home Rule as autonomous parts of Great Britain. This was enacted into law 8 months later as the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, but was rejected by the Irish Republicans led by Eamon de Valera, whose father was Spanish and mother Irish. I would like to say that the Catholic Church of Rome does not look favourably upon Catholics being ruled by persons of a different religions, either Protestant or Orthodox. So they always, I think they invested a lot of assets in separating Ireland from London, as well as separating Croatia from Belgrade. Much later. The civil war continued. The Round Table Group worked valiantly to stop the extremists on both sides, but with only moderate success. Amory's brother-in-law, Hamar Lord Greenwood, was appointed Chief Secretary for Ireland, the last incumbent of that post, while Curtis was appointed advisor on Irish affairs to the Colonial Office, which was headed by Milner and Amory. The Times and the Round Table condemned British repression in Ireland, the latter saying, quote, "The British Commonwealth can only be preserved by such means it would become a negation of the principle for which it has stood. but British violence could not be curtailed until Irish violence could be curtailed. One of the chief leaders of the Irish Republicans was Erskine Childers, an old schoolboy friend of Curtis who had been with him in South Africa. But nothing could be done through him since he had become fanatically anti-British. Accordingly, Smuts was called in. He wrote a conciliatory speech for King George to deliver at the opening of the Ulster Parliament, and made a secret visit to the rebel hiding place in Ireland to try to persuade the Irish Republican leaders to be reasonable. He contrasted the insecurity of the Transvaal Republic before 1895 with its happy condition under Dominion status since 1910, saying, quote, "Make no mistake about it, you have more privilege, more power, more peace, more security in such a sisterhood of equal nations than in a small nervous republic, having all the time to rely on the goodwill and perhaps the assistance of foreigners. What sort of independence do you call that?" End quote. Smuts arranged an armistice and a conference to negotiate a settlement. From this conference, at which Curtis was secretary, came the Articles of Agreement of December 1921, which gave Southern Ireland Dominion status as the Irish Free State, Northern Ireland continuing under the Act of 1920. The boundary line between the two countries was drawn by a committee of three, of which the British member and chairman was Richard Feetham of Milner's Kindergarten and the Round Table Group, later Supreme Court judge in South Africa. De Valera's Irish Republicans refused to accept the settlement and went into insurrection, this time against the moderate Irish leaders Arthur Griffith and Mike Collins. Collins was assassinated and Griffith died, exhausted by the strain, but the Irish people themselves were now tired of turmoil. De Valera's forces were driven underground and were defeated in the election of 1922. When De Valera's party, the Fianna Fáil, a party that still exists in Ireland today, did win an election in 1932 and he became President of Ireland, he abolished the oath of loyalty to the King and the office of Governor-General, ended annual payments on seized English lands and appeals to the Privy Council, engaged in a bitter tariff war with Britain, and continued to demand the annexation of Ulster. One of the last links with Britain was ended in 1938, when the British naval bases in Eire were turned over to the Irish to the great benefit of German submarines in 1939 and 1945.